Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll take just a moment to allow everyone to arrive and settle into the room, and then we will get started with today's event with Sharon Salzberg and Sameet Kumar. Okay, we'll get started. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Carolyn, the events manager here at Tricycle. We're so thrilled to have our special guests today, Sharon Salzberg and Sameet Kumar, here with us today to lead a discussion and practice around working with grief and loss in the time of a global pandemic. So today's event is a Zoom webinar, which means that audio and video of all attendees is turned off due to the large number of participants. But although we won't be able to see each other, we chose to call today's session a circle because we're gathering here in this virtual space together for shared practice. Everyone participating today is moving through some kind of loss in their lives. And for the next hour, we're holding our grief together as a collective. Today's Zoom session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live, and we'll make it available on Tricycle's YouTube channel. The link is posted in the chat in case you'd like to share it with friends who can't be here, or if you want to watch it again. We're providing this event for free, so if you haven't already and would like to support Tricycle, please consider giving at the donation link in the chat. We'll also put a link in the chat to Sameet's book, Grieving Mindfully, and a special discount on Sharon's online courses with Tricycle. So we'll leave some time for a short Q&A at the end of this hour-long discussion. Feel free to leave a question, a thought, or reflection in the chat box or in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce today's guest speakers. Sharon Salzberg is a meditation teacher and best-selling author who's been teaching Buddhism in the West since 1974. She's co-founder with Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, and the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies. Her popular books on Buddhism include Loving Kindness, Real Happiness, Real Love, The Art of Mindful Connection, and most recently, Real Change, Mindfulness to Heal Ourselves and the World. Dr. Sameet Kumar is a clinical psychologist at the Memorial Cancer Institute and Moffitt Hematology and Cellular Therapy Program. He obtained his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Miami in 2001, and he's worked with adults who have cancer as well as their caregivers and families for over 20 years, specializing in palliative care, survivorship, and grief using mindfulness and existential approaches. He's the author of the best-selling book, Grieving Mindfully, A Compassionate and Spiritual Approach to Coping with Loss, The Mindful Path Through Worry and Rumination, and the workbook, Mindfulness for Prolonged Grief. Thank you so much, Sharon and Sameet, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and I think it's long overdue for some of us. It's been a very challenging year and a half, going on 2 years soon, since it seemed like everything changed. And there's been a lot of losses, and not all of these losses have to do with people dying. We've lost a lot as a society, as individuals, as groups, as a culture. And there's a lot of pain in that. And for those of you who've lost loved ones in the pandemic, there's another layer of pain in perhaps not being able to be close to your loved one in their final moments, or feeling separated or alienated from the process of what's happened. And one of my hopes for this circle is that we can start the ball rolling on restoring a sense of sanctity to our pain, a sense of sanctity to the preciousness of human life, of our grief, and of being able to hold our pain in a way that gives us a sense of meaning and connection, maybe not with each other as much as we would like, but perhaps to ourselves. So at least we have a sense of connection with our deepest, most innermost processes, things that the Buddha taught about many years ago, many thousands of years ago, about the nature of suffering and how it can propel us into a better version of ourselves.
Indeed. I mean, it's such an extraordinary time, isn't it? And it's been so long. I mean, it's I'm speaking to you today not from Barre, Massachusetts, where I've been largely, but from New York City. And I remember leaving here originally March 14th, 2020, thinking things are very kind of anxious here and it's so intense and nobody really knows much. And maybe I'll just go up to Barry and ride this out. So I'll go up for 2 weeks. And of course, I was there for a year and a half. Um, so when I think of grieving, I also think of uh, several things. One is the variability of that sense of loss. It could certainly be a person in this time. It could be shattered expectations. It could be idealism. One of my principal examples of grief in my life, which was a learning to call it grief, was a friend, a soldier who was returning directly from Iraq and ended up at my retreat center in Barrie, which is not really highly recommended, to go like immediately from a war zone to an intensive silent retreat. Nonetheless, he did. And so we sort of created a parallel program for him. And he was so distraught and, so traumatized, really. And at one point, the colleague of mine who was teaching the formal retreat that was going on, who his name is Rodney Smith, and he'd founded 2 hospices in his life. And he said to me about this friend, he said, "Don't you see he's grieving?" And it sort of put the pieces together in a very different way for me. Instead of calling it PTSD or something that is a lot kind of more intense in a way and unwieldy and maybe stigmatized, it was like, he's grieving. And then suddenly I felt like I could relate to him much more closely in that process.
Yeah, wow, what you hit on all the key points. I don't know of anyone who's suffered a loss in these last couple of years, soon to be couple of years. I don't know anyone who's suffered a loss that hasn't had an element of trauma in it in the past year and a half. And it doesn't have to be because it was lost from COVID. It doesn't have to be because somebody died in the hospital. It can be because I think for so many of us, the level of tension and stress and collective trauma, collective grief is so big, and it's become such a heavy burden that to experience loss in this time is different from any loss that we've experienced before for at least 100 years since the last pandemic. And it's posed its own challenges. So I think, speaking to that point, we have grief and trauma coexisting. And I'd like to kind of remind myself that everybody experiences grief differently. No two people will experience it the same, and no two griefs are the same. But I think this is like no two griefs are the same, but more so. And I kind of want to give verbal expression to that and permission and allow a recognition of just how incredibly difficult this time has been for so many of us, and to kind of put the pieces together that I think maybe to have an easy time right now is the crazy thing, right? To suffer is the normal thing right now. And if you've made it through the past year and a half happy go lucky and feeling great, I'll have what you're having, but maybe not. But for most of us, the suffering that we've endured in the past year and a half and borne witness to with our loved ones and ourselves, and perhaps if you've um, contracted the virus and have had the long COVID, which brings its own set of losses also, um, it has been under a different context and one that is uncharted, and it can feel very isolating and alone. So, right now we have 413 people here with us, and we're all here together to kind of navigate and circle around the same thing, is that we have suffered immensely and we may continue to suffer immensely. And there's a value in connection, and there's a value in finding a way to navigate, find the words that give structure to the pain that really is far more immense than any words we can find. But the words help.
Yeah, I mean, your words recently, just in the last couple of moments, were very interesting when you talked about not being alone and feeling alone, because it would seem that, of course, there is the primary pain of change and loss and bereavement and all of that. And then on top of that, there is, sort of the immensity of either a real isolation or a superimposed isolation, because we feel, we can't communicate what's happening to us, that no one will understand, or we have to, it's interesting to look at one's conditioning, of course, like I grew up, and part of my childhood was with my grandparents, who were Eastern European immigrants, and who felt it would be hurtful to talk about sad things. Like my mother's death when I was 9, was just never spoken about. And it was the kind of situation where if you said a word like cancer, you had to whisper it. It's like, it was, I don't know if it was bad luck, it was something, like you just had to say cancer in a voice like that. And I was teaching once, a few years ago at a university hospital in the oncology ward, your home turf, although not at your hospital. And I found myself kind of lowering my voice to say cancer. And I thought, this is ridiculous, and I talked about it. It's a very particular kind of conditioning, like these are things that need to be hidden. And it's so interesting in a pandemic where it's like exploded in public, but yet still we might have that kind of conditioning.
Yeah. And I think there's something about that. We still carry the residue of, if you say the word, it's going to spread the pain or spread the disease in some way. It doesn't work that way, but it feels like it sometimes. And that carries over with grief too, especially if you're a practitioner and you experience suffering. Your dear friend and one of my most cherished teachers, Ram Dass, he talks about this so much, that he went through all these decades of intense practice and incredible experiences. And when he had his stroke, his thought was, as he relays it, is, oh my God, I'm not prepared for this. And this is after decades of practice and dedicated practice and teaching. And some of us who are dedicated practitioners, when we find ourselves suffering, we kind of feel like, well, gee, this wasn't supposed to be this bad, right? Like I'm supposed to be insulated from it. I'm supposed to be able to kind of walk away from it in a better way. And I think there's something about that tendency to want to whisper about the suffering and, yeah, it's happening, but I don't really want it to happen to me, or talk about it, or be around people who are experiencing it, because it's just too challenging. And yet here we are, in this space of practice today, and we're all kind of operating under this assumption, the first noble truth, right? Like suffering is, you didn't do anything wrong to earn it. It's just it's part of the package. We signed the contracts to come here, and it is just something that we experience universally in big ways and in little ways. And so it's, accepting words, accepting emotions, and accepting pain, which just feels so overwhelming and so isolating and so strange. And I think for a lot of people I talk to, and including myself, when I have experienced grief, it doesn't seem manageable. It just doesn't feel manageable at all. And, spoiler alert, it's not really manageable. One of the things that I do recommend that people try to consider is just managing one day. Don't try to carry all of the grief all at once. It's too big. It's much bigger than we are. I think when we experience grief, we experience the collective grief. We experience everyone else's pain. There's like this collective residue that's there of all our experience of pain, and we find ourselves just completely overwhelmed by it. And it's okay to be overwhelmed by it, but just take it one day at a time. Just one day at a time. The same rules apply for grief as apply to practice. It's one day at a time. One day at a time.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And I think I thought of two things actually when you were speaking. One was in terms of not sort of being prepared or ready to really feel what life can feel like. Sometimes I was with the Dalai Lama once in this gathering, and a friend of mine who just had a terrible phobia about death. She was terrified of the idea of dying. And she was just having a conversation with him, and she was telling him this, and he was saying that every day he does a reflection in very Buddhist light, like someday there's death, this life is impermanent, needs to be lived, day by day, and the preciousness of this existence and so on. And she said to him, do you think that's going to help you when you're actually dying? And he said, I hope so. Like, no guarantee, but I hope so. And I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah.
And then the other was a Ram Dass story, because he lived the last years of his life on Maui, and occasionally I'd go up and teach with him. And once I was sitting in the back of the room of like 350 people, and he was speaking, and very halting. He had aphasia. His speech was quite affected, and that was also interesting. That for somebody who, those of you who've heard his earlier talks, it was like a golden tongue. That was his superpower. And suddenly those long gaps, and silence, and yet he went out and did it. And he said that the hardest thing of all for him after the stroke, more than the physical pain, more than living in a wheelchair, more than the changes in his speech, and that kind of limitation, was having to accept help, was having to ask for help. And he said it was the hardest thing of all and the most liberating. And I had known him, I met him in my first retreat, which was January of 1971. And I'd say it was absolutely true about him. He was a helper, he was a giver. He was always taking care of other people. You couldn't even give him a birthday present, He was like, and then all of a sudden he had to ask for help. And he said, one of his famous books, of course, was called How Can I Help? And he said, now I want to write a book called How Can You Help Me? Because it was so profound. And anyone who saw him in those years as he was approaching his death, which was pretty recent, it was like he was made of light. He was made of love and light, truly. There was no barrier anymore where the energy was only going out and couldn't come in. And so you could just see his freedom. And it's hard for us to ask for help when we're suffering, but it seems really essential that we learn that skill.
Yeah. Getting help and knowing that we're in pain and that we haven't done anything wrong to experience the pain. There's stories of some Buddhist teachers who talk to people who are experiencing grief, and they're like, well, you should really just stop thinking about it. And I haven't found that to be very helpful advice. We don't seem to work that way here. And there's a certain level of, I think, unexpected and unrequested courage to face the moment, which is something that we learn in our practice. And hopefully we've come to our practice before we've experienced loss. But if we haven't, then loss is a very, very ripe, fertile terrain to start the practices in.
Yeah.
And again, though, it's not about turning the pain off as much as finding a way to hold it and find a way to be present with the pain, which paradoxically enough doesn't actually reduce it, but it makes it a little bearable. Which for that one day at a time approach is pretty fantastic. It does feel completely overwhelming, and all the varieties of emotions. I noticed in the chat box there's a couple of concerns about anger and anticipatory grief. And yes, there's a lot of anger that a lot of people have for a variety of reasons, of opportunities lost, of quality times, trips, moments that we could have spent together that we weren't able to because of the pandemic. I worked with a lot of people going through cancer treatment who they were robbed of their last year of life, in isolation, and they wanted to do things. They had a bucket list and weren't able to do it. And the kind of fear that a lot of people have picked up for anticipatory grief, that, if this has happened And it's kind of opened our eyes to how vulnerable we are as a society, as individuals, as families. How do we navigate those things? How do we navigate those difficult experiences? I wish there were easy answers, you know. Um, they're not really easy answers. It is really just trying to be present. And, from the scientific perspective, what these practices that we're going to be doing and that we have been doing, that we've been taught to do, and you don't have to do them well. You just have to do them somewhat consistently as much as you can. What these practices, from a scientific perspective, what they're really doing is helping us dampen down the stress response that we experience when we're in a lot of pain, physical pain and emotional pain, existential pain also. And that might be as good as it gets, is to just work with that stress response and make it a little bit better, just a little bit better. And some days it feels completely useless. And I remember in the weeks after my mother died, I took a few days off from the cushion because it was just the grief was overwhelming. I'm a grief author. I'm supposed to be really good at this, right? Well, I got like extra training now. I got a second fellowship after my mother died in grief, and took a few days off from the cushion. In the morning of her cremation, I sat back down on the cushion and I practiced in Vajrayana in Tibetan Buddhism. And for several weeks, it was just reciting the sadhana. I wasn't really into it at all. And at some point, it started to sort of give me flashes of connection to what the practice is and what it can do. And again, it didn't turn the pain off. It didn't turn it off at all. It didn't make me sleep any better. It didn't make my anger get quiet at all. But it reminded me that there's meaning to be found in it. And this precious human life that we speak of, part of what makes it so precious is because we don't have to operate on instinct. We can make choices about how to hold our pain. And hopefully it won't be with anger and bitterness or towards addictions or something like that. Although those things do happen. And sometimes we feel out of control in allowing them to happen. But part of what makes this life so precious is that we can choose how to respond to difficult moments.
Mhm.
We can choose a path of meaning, of love, compassion, of bodhicitta, of dedicating our pain to the betterment of ourselves and to other beings. It doesn't have to be as difficult as it automatically is. It can be difficult plus meaningful. You know, the meaning doesn't take away the pain. It's an addition to the pain.
Some people are also asking if you can define anticipatory grief. Like, what does it actually mean?
Yeah, anticipatory grief is, I think, if you're paying attention, the state of affairs that we spend most of our time in. It's the countdown towards the death or loss of a loved one or ourselves. In my work with cancer patients, it's the day of diagnosis for a lot of people. That when you're given a very bad diagnosis, and it sort of begins this, it feels like you're in the last part of the hourglass, with the last bits of sand, and they're slipping away. Um, that's um, anxiety, stress, and distress about an impending loss that hasn't happened yet. And in a lot of ways, it can rob us of our final moments, of our final months, sometimes years with a loved one, because we think, oh, they're going to go away, they're going to leave us. And so the challenge again is that what these practices can do on a good day is maybe turn off some of the stress that comes with anticipatory grief, help us to be present, even if it's for a moment, maybe just a few seconds that we wouldn't have been present otherwise. That's good enough. One of
Mhm.
the phrases I play around with anticipatory grief is, what's the best possible we can do right now? Not necessarily the ideal, but what's the best possible? And I think that's a good navigational beacon to use for the pain. What's the best possible?
Yeah, I mean, one person, I don't even remember who it was, wrote somewhere um, that grief is love that doesn't have the normal place to land. The situation is gone, the person is gone, or the idealism is gone, something is gone. And something that's helped me, is remembering that there's love at the root of it, there's love at the heart of it. And, because a lot of people are writing in, like, how do I deal with the pain? The pain is so searing, the pain is so bad. And it is, but there's also love in there. And when it's time, and not in a way to push away the pain or deny it, but um, to get a fuller picture of life. It's
Yeah.
like we reclaim that as well. And it reminds me of you and I, before we started, we were talking about Parkland and because you live in Florida, and I've, been connected to that community. And the first time I went down there to teach, Parkland is the scene of a terrible school shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And this young woman who was in my class said, I feel really weird, because this is kind of incredible to be here and to learn these tools and to, be together in this way, kind of a healing way almost. And she said, and I know the only reason that it happened is because that horrible thing happened. And I don't know how to get over that in order to appreciate this. And I said, I don't know that we ever get over it, but we learn to hold them both at once.
Yeah.
We learn to hold the pain and the joy of the meaning or the fact that there was love, at the center of things, or we've learned something new about love and are going on in a different way. And it's very, very hard, but that's sort of essential. And she's an incredible young woman. Her mother is a teacher at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and she's, she wasn't harmed, but certainly she knew many people who were killed, and she's a very big part of the community. And so this, the whole community was very strongly affected. So in talking about that, saying we learn to hold them both at once, the joy and the sorrow, I said in Buddhist teaching, we call that equanimity, which doesn't mean indifference. It means like a big enough perspective to hold all aspects of the truth. And we talked about the yin yang symbol. We're in the kind of light part, there's the circle of darkness, and in the dark part, there's the circle of light. So then, I didn't see her for quite a while, and then I think it was when my book came out, Real Change. I did a series of webinars and things like that, and I did a webinar with people who were from Parkland.
Mm-hmm.
And so Samantha is her name. She was in the webinar. And I said, hey, Samantha, remember that conversation we had a few years ago about equanimity and the yin yang symbol and the dark and the light? And she said, not only do I remember it, I think about it every single day of my life. She said, that's my North Star.
Yeah.
That's what I try to make my choices by and guide them by. So she was sort of an incredible teacher for me at that moment.
Yeah. And some of these perspectives take a long time for some of us to develop. And, I always shy away from telling people that, in 2 months you should be here, and 3 months here, and 6 months there. I really don't believe in those things at all. For me, I've always thought of grief as having 2 stages, up and down, and they change as time goes on. It's very nonlinear. It seems to be circular. And those perspectives, if you're finding that they're eluding you right now, it's okay. It's quite all right. That's part of equanimity too, right? Is being able to hold the ambiguity of not knowing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's terrible when, you think about the things we say to one another, you think, I can't believe it. One of my favorite quotations is from Joan Halifax, Roshi Joan Halifax, who said something like, you should never force yourself to try to think of the traumas of your life as gifts. They're givens. That's the truth. It happened, now I have to deal with it. And it's such an incredible line that,
wow.
I mean, I really cherish it, because of course we say these terrible things to one another, like, you'll find meaning in this, or is truly
this
terrible.
happened for a reason. This will make you stronger. None of these things really resonate.
No.
I think people mean well, but it's so easy, especially with COVID, to sink into bitterness and anger about the isolation and the kind of collective bad directions we've moved in to keep this thing going. it's very easy to sink into that bitterness, but we have to try to find a way, maybe not permanently, but just for today, to keep that light within, to
Yeah,
keep that
yeah,
perspective.
yeah. Now people are asking a number of questions, which I feel like asking you. And at some point, we're going to do some practice. But um,
Yeah.
somebody asked, uh, "Is there a chance you'll talk about disenfranchised grief loss?" I don't know exactly what that is.
I'm not sure what that is now, but just kind of going off the words, I think maybe that's what we've all experienced in the past year and a half. It certainly sounds like it. Um, this sort of, I've always shied away from the term closure, but, grief without closure, grief without contact in isolation is what disenfranchised grief sounds to me like. And I think that's why we're all here, in recognition of how that is, of how that has been.
I mean,
Usually,
the things in this chat are kind of incredible,
yeah,
and so sad in so many ways. So
yeah.
I
I'm
don't know.
hearing a lot of themes of anger, and I do want to point out that in psychology, we think of anger as a very valid outlet for distress, which has two other outlets, depression and anxiety. So anger is sort of like the ugly cousin of depression and anxiety, which are a lot more popular. We want to talk about depression and anxiety, but anger is like, oh my God, that's so uncomfortable. That's so weird. But it's the same energy underneath it. There's an element of, I think, what we've all felt is powerlessness also in anger, and more so sometimes than with depression and with anxiety. But it is at the root of it. It's the same energy. It's the same emotional pain.
And I wonder if there's some passages in the Buddhist teaching about if you are with somebody and they are dying, or they're somewhere in that process, remind them of the good that they've done. And I've originally I thought that's so weird, like, because certainly it would foster more attachment in a time when the person has to let go of everything, but
Yeah.
in fact, when people have asked me, I've said it, because that's what's in there in the teaching. And every single time somebody has come back and said it was perfect. Because maybe it's like reminding the person there is love, we have had love, um, and there is something kind of unbroken about that, even though
Yeah.
the situation is so radically changing and altering.
Yeah. Yeah. The Tibetan Buddhist practices for POA, the conscious dying, I think they, in a nutshell, can be boiled down to, at the moment of death, try to remember love. Just try to remember love. And it can be a fraction of a second.
Hmm.
And from the deaths I've witnessed, it seems that a lot of times people who are in incredible amounts of pain die in a state of grace sometimes. And you see sort of a change happen in the body. Not always, um, but sometimes it is always possible into the last moments.
Okay, so somebody put in the chat, miscarriage, animal companion loss, suicide, COVID, AIDS are all examples of disenfranchised losses.
Yeah.
Losses that aren't socially sanctioned, born alone in silence.
Oh, oh. Yeah, I mean, there's a concept also called cumulative grief, which a lot of our healthcare providers, my colleagues, are dealing with. And disenfranchised grief kind of, I think in that sense of the definition is tied into it. Cumulative grief is that, this collection of loss that we've experienced throughout all our lives, sometimes it finds the most unlikely outlet. You couldn't find that favorite book of yours, and all of a sudden it feels like things collapse. I think loss of a pet is completely valid. Some of us who've worked in healthcare, we've known a lot of people who died this year, and we haven't grieved them all evenly. But there's one person who it seems like all the pain gets focused on, one loss in general, that it seems all of our grief is pouring out of and directed towards. Allow it. Allow it. That's the only thing I can say. Grieving a pet, sometimes people grieve a celebrity that they don't know. It hits them really, really hard. That's totally valid. That's totally valid. This is the human experience.
I wanted to ask you about caregivers because it's such a passion of mine anyway, and I have been uh, working with various people who I considered on the front lines of suffering and often, not celebrated in the way they really deserve to be. And that's been, both domestically and then internationally, and then back now, domestically with a lot of healthcare workers, and with whom, by the way, there's also a great deal of anger.
Yeah.
I discovered, working with ambulance drivers and EMT people, and feeling quite unsupported by society in many ways. And the toll, and people, a lot of people are writing in the chat, they were personal caregivers, were partner or child or something like that. And it's such a difficult and complex role, to exercise. And I know that you worked, aside from your regular job, during this last time, you worked with nurses and people like that, remotely, since you couldn't get into the COVID wards.
Yeah, in the beginning last year, it was remote. And in the past couple of months, as our extraordinary peak in South Florida started to decline, I was able to go in person and meet with them on the COVID units and in COVID intensive care units. And yeah, I think it is, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of collective loss. I think mostly it's just sadness for this latest peak that was avoidable, but not everybody who suffered was able to avoid it. Some of them were vaccinated and it was brought home, and they had failing health for other reasons, and there it is. But even aside from the vaccination issues, we're dealing with much younger people, moms, dads, siblings, husbands, wives, children, and it just seems unfair. It just seems so unfair. And it's going to take a long time for any sort of healing to have a sustained effect in soothing some of that anger. But maybe what we can do, Sharon, if it's okay, is direct the time towards some collective practice, so we can harness the power of all over 400 of us together.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I wondered
together.
If we might each lead a practice, if you thought that would
Sure
work.
Sure.
So why don't you start, and then
okay
I'll pick up from there.
Okay. So to begin our practice, find yourself as comfortable as you can. If you're walking, then don't close your eyes. Hopefully you're not driving, but if you're in a quiet room, I think really the best place to start any of these practices is with your posture. It shouldn't be rigid. It shouldn't be tight. It should be comfortable. And I like to think of the word dignified. We should have a dignified posture. And posture isn't just how we're holding our back and our head, but our attitude towards our suffering. A dignified posture towards this practice, and also a dignified posture towards our suffering. All the emotions come and go, and what we're going to be doing is bringing our awareness back to our breath. And I'm a big fan of making sure that we're focusing on the exhale, because there is so much stress, and focusing on exhalation is very relaxing. Maybe what we can do is just focus on 21 exhalations in a row. And I will put myself out there in a vulnerable position, and I will stay silent. And when I've taken 21 exhalations, I'll transition over to Sharon and begin. Okay. Sharon, if you would like to begin.
Sure. And then there's one
Practice.
question in there, which I think would be good for you to respond to about
Sure.
not being able to do that many breaths, but I can start first if you like.
Mm-hmm.
There were two things. One was a story and one was a practice. Because there's some ways in which we inhibit just out of habit what we're feeling. And it's, we use our awareness, hopefully, to be able to more say, okay, this is what's happening, without all the sort of strategies about how to make it different. And it will change on its own because life is change. And yet, for now, this is what's happening. And it reminded me of in 1984, we brought Burmese meditation master to Barry to teach a 3-month retreat, which several of us were sitting under his guidance. We'd never met him before. His name was Sayadaw U Pandita, and he was a great, great teacher. And he was also like incredibly fierce and intense and demanding. And we were seeing him, just the form of the retreat is that we were seeing him 6 days a week for these very short meetings where we would just describe our practice and he would give some feedback about what to do. So not too long before that retreat, a friend of mine had died by suicide, and it was a really bad death. And I was very much thinking about him in the course of the retreat. And yet, I was very reluctant to talk to who was actually a stranger, this teacher, about him. And, he's from another culture, he was monk, I wasn't sure he was really going to understand. But finally, 6 days a week, you have to say what's going on. So I started to say, my friend died. And then he said to me, Sayadaw Pandita said to me, "Are you very sad?" And I said, "I am very sad." And then he said, "Are you crying?" And I thought, uh-oh. So I said, "I'm just crying a little bit." And he kind of like shook his head and he said, "Every time you cry, you should cry your heart out. That way you'll get the best relief." You could have knocked me over with a feather. It was so different from what I expected and so important. So that is true. We feel what we feel, and we need to be able to accommodate it, with presence and as much clarity as we can have, and as much kindness toward ourselves as we can have. But the practice that I thought of is a very, very classical practice within the Buddhist tradition that also, you may take symbolically if the cultural context doesn't necessarily resonate with you, like rebirth, things like that, which is very much a part of those cultures. And the belief is that the strongest connection we can have with someone beyond the body, beyond time and space, is our own good-heartedness. And it's like coming back to that love, that space of love. And so what's done is really this practice. It's called sharing merit, where if you've done something toward the good, you've made a donation somewhere, or you've been kind, or you've been restrained, like it would be awfully easy to tell a lie, that's considered to generate a positive energy. That's what the merit is that positive energy. If you meditate, even if it feels like your concentration is completely crummy, if you're trying to understand things more deeply, you're studying, you're questioning, all of those are like meritorious actions. And so the idea is that if we do an action like that, not to just blow it off, but to let ourselves feel the positive energy. It's not egoic or conceited. It's really about the force of goodness moving through us. And then, having felt it or acknowledged it, we offer it, we dedicate it to those who've helped us, to those who've died, to those we know are struggling, and finally to all beings everywhere. But it's very classical. It's like in Burma, where I practiced, the meals are all donations. You don't pay anything to be there. Everything you need is offered to you. And it's like if a daughter was graduating from high school, they'd go off to the monastery and offer food to as many people as they could afford to feed. If somebody had died, they would go to the monastery and offer food in honor of the memory of that person. And then there would be a ceremony to offer the positive energy. And in fact, that's something Upandita said to me when I was talking to him about my friend. He said, well, now you have to do the retreat for both of you. So every night at the end of the day, you've practiced all day. I want you to share the merit, the positive energy with your friend. And of course, it makes literal sense in those cultures that believe in rebirth. And if you don't, that doesn't really matter. It makes a kind of symbolic sense that this is the thread, that can actually keep us together in a different way. And so maybe we'll take a few questions and then I'll end with a sharing of the merit, because the gathering itself is meritorious.
I want to just kind of piggyback on that a little bit, that, for so many of us, the practice is so difficult when we're in such pain. And the advice I would give is just do what you can. Just do what you can. And if it helps, because some of these routines and rituals get so disrupted with loss. For me, practice became my grief ritual. And, it was pretty crummy for a long time. I was really bad at it. It was probably a waste of time is how it felt. But I would get up at an ungodly early hour anyway. So I figured if I'm going to be up at 4:30 in the morning, so I can't sleep because of grief, I might as well be sitting on the cushion and, not wasting my time in bed going, why can't I sleep? And so, setting up a practice goal that if you can't do 21 breaths yet, maybe by the end of the year, give it a year and see what you can get, see what you can do.
And somebody put something in the chat about Judaism. So another part of that story was that when I was in Burma, the meals are this very formal occasion. It's like there are only 2 of them a day, but there's like a processional into the dining room, and then you come in and you bow to the Buddha, and you're sitting in these tables of like 4 people, and the food is served family style. And so I did that whole formal thing, and then I looked at the food and I thought, this looks like a Jewish meal. That looks like chicken soup. That looks like white fish salad. I'm hallucinating. Something's gone really awry in my meditation. It turned out that Burma, Rangoon, had a minuscule Jewish population, and somebody had died. And so the family had come and not only had offered the money, but they offered the recipes.
Oh, wow.
So it literally was a Jewish meal. Mm-hmm. And then, we were there for like the sharing of the merit ceremony. So there's a kind of beauty in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just reading through some of the questions here as well.
Can you tell us in 2 words what would be helpful for the grieving process for those of us who don't have our relatives around and live by ourselves?
Best possible, really. I mean, there's just, there's such a temptation to say, if you do X, Y, or Z, everything's going to be all better. But my approach is always grief is nonlinear. It moves in circles, and just do the best you can.
And give yourself a break, like I remember, long before COVID, I was talking to somebody who said, I feel so bad, I'm doing so poorly, and I'm like, I should be more together, I should have more going on. So I said, well, why don't you write out everything that has happened to you this year? And she chose instead to draw it, not to write it out, but it was like, my cat died, my brother and I got estranged, my house burnt down. And it was like, I want you to look at this picture, this is hard.
Wow.
It's hard stuff.
Wow.
And this has been an extraordinarily hard time. And I think we need to acknowledge that. And Sameet, I have another question for you. Like, what do you mean by 21 breaths? Is it in and out 21 times?
Yeah, 21 exhalations. 21 exhalations. And there's There's a series of numbers that are often used in Tibetan Buddhism about how often you're supposed to do these mantra recitations or awareness of the breath. 1,008, 108, 21, 7, 3. It can come down to like if all you can do is a second or a minute, that's the best possible for that day. And at least it was something. And it's kind of just building a continuity of practice and building a continuity of connection with our capacity to make meaning, find love in our pain, find love for ourselves in our pain.
And I want to ask you maybe one more question, and then do the practice. But someone had asked about how to approach, say, the children of somebody who had died in terms of conversation. And do you have something? I'm trying to remember when this friend who had died, and his daughter, who was maybe 4 years old, and Stephen Levine and all the people we consulted said, well, take her to a toy store and get her like this little fuzzy thing she can hold and get comfort from. So we took her to a toy store, and all she wanted was this truck. And we kept saying, no, don't you want like a little fuzzy thing you can hold? And it was like, no, I want that truck. Okay.
Yeah.
But do you have any recommendations just for that conversation?
It really depends on the kid and your relationship to them. Some of the younger children, they feel very responsible when something bad happens, that, they didn't call this person enough, or they ignored them, or they wished something bad on them and got hurt or something like that. So we kind of want to talk about how sometimes, bad things happen, and depending on the family and the child's belief system, is there a way to maintain a connection to somebody who's died that's not kind of creepy and scary? um, Sharing the merit. We can, when we experience something beautiful, we can empower children that you can think about this person who's not here, your grandma, grandpa, or your parent, or your sibling, and maybe they'll get it, maybe they won't, but we can try. And it's learning to hold the pain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's sit for a few minutes. And I'll guide you through the way that I do a sharing of the merit. And please feel free to change the words in your own mind, as suits you. So once again, you can sit comfortably, close your eyes or not. And even just having been here together, you took the time to do this. This is a hard stuff, and you wanted to understand yourself better and your experience better. And you can rejoice in that, actually. Lots of ways of spending an hour, and here we are, and we can take delight in that. And then honestly feeling that positive energy of seeking, of trying, we begin to dedicate it. And so I use words first, thinking of those who've helped me, just whoever comes to mind. I dedicate the merit of my practice to you. May you be safe, be happy, be peaceful. And if people who have died, or animals, beloveds who have died, come to mind, repeating that in whatever words you're using. I share the merit of my practice with you. May you be safe, be happy, be peaceful. And then all beings everywhere, and an affirmation of the fact that our inner work could never be just for ourselves alone. I dedicate the merit of my practice to all beings. May all beings be safe, be happy, be peaceful. So once again, the merit of the practice is the positive energy generated by caring, by coming together, by questioning, by meditating, however terrible it seems to be. And we offer it unstintingly. So thank you so much.
Thank you all for spending this time with us.
And thank you, Sameet. It's always really good to see you and hear you.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. You've been a guiding light for so many, especially this past year and a half.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Sameet, for that beautiful discussion and practice. Thank you to everyone who joined in, who shared their experiences, who shared their merits. We clearly had people who have gone through all different kinds of loss, and it was really beautiful to see everyone sharing and coming together. So thank you all. If you benefited from this offering, we invite you to support Tricycle with a donation, and we will put the link in the chat box. It's just tricycle.org/donate. We'll also put a link in the chat box to Sameet's book, Grieving Mindfully. If you'd like some more resources, you can look there. And you'll find a link as well to Sharon's courses with Tricycle. If you'd like to go deeper into some of Sharon's beautiful heart practices, we're offering $20 off all of Sharon's Tricycle online courses. And we will follow up with an email with an event replay if you'd like to watch it again, and with all of these resources that I've just mentioned. So thank you again, Sharon and Sameet, and hope everyone has a beautiful evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.